So, welcome to our online lecture format. In this lecture, we're going to talk about presentation tips and tricks and styles and all that sort of stuff. So, to begin with, I want to give a little overview about the different formats in which you might be trying to present your work and give some ideas about what happens there before we talk about them in specific. So first off, we could have written documents. Written documents are the way that we have conveyed information as a species for several thousand years. Now, the nice thing about written documents is that you have the opportunity to be extremely thorough and explain yourself in very precise details. You don't have to worry about misspeaking because you can delete and try again, and you can be very, very, very thorough. The downside is that people don't like to read stuff very often. And a big long document can be extremely overwhelming. But one way that you can sort of defeat that is actually to have some decent structure. And one of the things that you've noticed in my actual online notes is that by having these sections on one side or the other, you actually have a very nice way of browsing and finding your information and seeing what's going to happen prior to actually reading. And so this actually is a very useful trick. So a good document structure that people know what to expect is actually really, really important. Now let's go back to my presentation. The next downside of written documentation is that there's no user interaction. The writer and the reader never meet face to face. And as a result, the writer has to anticipate what the user or the reader doesn't know and what questions they're going to ask. And so you have to be very thoughtful in terms of what content gets presented. And then finally, writing documents can take a long, long, long time. It's very time consuming to produce written documentation instead of sort of interacting with the presenter and the learner interacting. So there are good things and bad things about written documents. They're very thorough, they're very good, but they take a lot of time and it's pretty overwhelming. In contrast, oral presentations are actually really a very, very different beast. You have interaction with your audience, and that allows you to discover where people are confused and spend time to address that. And you can make up information sort of on the fly to try to explain things. Now, this takes work to understand when people are confused, and you have to read the expression on people's faces because not everyone is going to raise their hand and say something when something's confusing. So it takes a little bit of experience to learn how to gauge the level of confusion that an audience has. But in general, oral presentations can be really a good way of presenting data or information to people. Now, the downside is that it's not permanent. Unless you unless you record it in some fashion, either record the presentation, but then it's asynchronous, which has the same problem as written communication. Now, the final way that your work gets presented is when other people see your amazing graphics and think, wow, that explains this concept so very, very perfectly. And ideally, when they borrow your graphics, they will attribute from whom it came from. And certainly when you're presenting work in, you should attribute when you borrow other people's graphics. Now, the thing about this is that your work is going to be used by other people and the context that you're intending it for might be lost. And so as a result, whenever you're making graphics that you think are going to be really, really good and other people might use them, you need your graphic to contain the context and interpretation and the references that you want to be there. And so sometimes in your graphics, there's a lot of polishing that goes on with the idea that other people are going to borrow this and put it into their work. One of the hardest parts about giving a presentation is understanding the audience level understanding of the content of what you're talking about before you prepare. So if I'm talking about a subject to a teenager or a child, this is a very different audience than if I'm talking to one of my peers in my area of specialization. And being able to switch between those levels is a very, very important thing to be able to do. Um, and really, uh, you probably have experience where you have teachers that are speaking way higher over your head, and other cases where they sort of dumb down everything and are way too basic. So the goal really needs to be to address the audience really correctly. You need to anticipate the background knowledge that your audience has, and don't beat them over the head with stuff that they already know. Don't, I mean, you don't have to reiterate what they already know, but at the same time, you have to anticipate what they don't know and fully explain that. And this is a really, really hard thing to do right. This is, I think, by far, me as a teacher, that's the hardest thing to do, is to try to get the right level of background understanding for any given presentation. That's really hard. So be mindful of that. So when I think about the audience, I really think about a couple of different levels of understanding that I want to aim for. And this is just my breakdown of what I think about. So I like to think about sort of a high school educated individual. And that's sort of when I describe my work or what I do. If I think about a high school educated person that doesn't have a lot of background education, that's a nice level to be able to target. Um, then the next thing is you might think about a college educated person with some knowledge of the subject, but not necessarily a huge amount of knowledge, but at the very least has some. And then finally, an expert in the subject area. Now, I've got some links here to 3 articles that all were based off of one particular research paper that came out here at NAU. And this particular paper, there are 3 different articles that came out. And in the first one, it is very light on the science. It basically talks about microbiomes, which are bacterial fingerprints that can identify individuals or locations. And this particular study looked at 3 different cities, Flagstaff, San Diego, and Toronto. And they found out that the microbial communities within those offices were pretty different from city to city, but within a city, they were fairly similar. And that was really interesting. Um, Now, you've got a second article that goes into that describes that same research article, and they go into a lot more detail about how the data was collected and see a little bit more about the underlying microbial understanding. And so they talk about 16S ribosomal RNA sequences, and but it doesn't spend a lot of time at that. So someone who's had a microbiology class in their background, even if they don't do microbiology, can probably understand this level of information. And then the actual research article here is targeted very much towards experts in the field. And honestly, even though I was on this paper, I don't understand everything in it. So sort of this is the same content and the same fundamental idea, but presented at 3 different levels of understanding. And another nice example of this shifting in details is this YouTube series by Wired Magazine called 5 Levels, and this is really a lot of fun. They take an expert in a field and ask them to explain it to 5 different people. In this case, a child, a teenager, an undergrad majoring in the same subject, grad student, and a colleague. So they're shifting their detail level as they move from one audience to another. And this is a very, very important thing to be able to do, and to recognize what is the appropriate level of detail to use in a presentation. So, in the written documentation stuff, we were talking about having a good outline was important for people to understand how to move around your document and do it intelligently. Now, in this outline, we've got a couple of different things that we want to talk about. Now, the first thing that we'll talk about in just about any sort of written communication or presentation is the background information. Now, this background information is whatever your audience needs to understand what you were doing. Now, keeping in mind, you have to be aware of what your audience is. So, the background, if I'm talking to sort of a lay audience who doesn't know much, then I might be very thoughtful about what background information I need to avoid giving too much detail. But I also can't get them completely lost as well. So this is pretty tricky. Um, Now, you don't want to give too much background because otherwise you never get to the point and you're just the audience is just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for you to finally say something that they actually care about as opposed to just giving background detail. It's probably better to give a little more detail than absolutely necessary, but if you overwhelm people with background detail, they're going to be very annoyed. All right, next, in context to this course, giving the source that the data came from is very important for making the case that what you're about to present actually is applicable. You want to make sure that people know that one, the data isn't just made up, so describing where and how it got collected is important, and understanding that it is applicable to the problem at hand is also important because I don't want to be talking about maybe the economic situation in Flagstaff with data that was gathered from New York City because those are vastly different environments. And so you want to sort of justify that even if your data isn't directly taken from the place that you care about, it's at least close enough that it makes sense. And so talking about your data sources and your methods for what you did to collect the data or how you're about to analyze it, that's actually important for people to add credibility to the argument that you're about to make. Now, I will say that the more sophisticated your audience is, the more important this section becomes. When I give talks to my colleagues, really the data source, the methodologies, these are the things that we really, really, really care about. And in fact, this section is probably the most important section, is how I went about doing the science that I did. Now, to a lay audience, to just a high schooler, they're not even going to know to ask that question. So as your audience gets more sophisticated, the data source and the methodology becomes more and more important. All right, next, you're going to present your results. So this is going to be the graphs that you've presented, the insights that you're able to glean from those graphs, and the overall understanding. So this is sort of the meat and the potatoes of your presentation, which is sort of after you got all the data, after you did all the data wrangling that you did, what did you actually learn? And so the results section is usually what you primarily care about as a scientist or as a person interested in the area that you're presenting on. Now, in the last section, this discussion section, I oftentimes think of this as what is the take-home message? Because when an audience observes a presentation or reads a document or something like that, one of the things that you end up with is, or have to realize, is that they are not going to remember everything that you said, unfortunately. And so you want to help your audience identify what are the important things. And so at the very end, I try to wrap up and kind of summarize the major points so that the audience knows sort of what was important and what should they remember. So that's really important. Now, I will say that, in most scientific writing, we actually have a few more things in here. So in scientific writing, there is an abstract, and this is sort of the one paragraph summary of what an article is. And this is oftentimes the only thing that I read about the entire article is I read sort of, one sentence of background, one sentence of methodology, one sentence of results, and one sentence of discussion. And this oftentimes really is a really nice summary. So most people read the abstract, and then once they read the abstract and decide, oh, maybe this is interesting, they actually totally skip everything and go all the way to the end to the discussion section and read the discussion section about where is the discussion section? Oh, there it is. It's all the way down at the bottom. And then the reader will go and read the discussion and try to understand what actually was sort of a little bit deeper detail. Then after that, if they're still interested, they'll jump back up to the introduction and sort of read the background information about why all of this matters and the background information to help identify things. And then finally go into the results and kind of read this in a little bit more detail. And then finally, if they're really geeky and they want to really get into what's going on, they read the materials and methods section. And so scientific writing actually has a very formatted style for the writing, just so that we can jump around very clearly and be able to read and say, all right, this is my quick summary. This is the big picture results. Here's the background information that I needed. And then here is sort of the detail level stuff that we wanted. So as a result, the format that I've been suggesting for you guys to present your presentations and your written stuff really is starting to follow this sort of technical writing outline. But it turns out that a lot of articles that are presented in the media actually follow the same setup. A article that went viral a couple years ago was this one. This is from a website called pudding.cool, and this is it's a online magazine, maybe, I don't know. But at any rate, they have an article talking about women's pockets. Now, if you go ahead and search for pudding women's pockets, you'll find it, but the link is right here as well. But I want to sort of analyze the style in which they wrote, because keep in mind this is intended to be a article that they're trying to make this go viral, and it's intended for a broad audience, so they can't get too technical, but at the same time they have a really important point, and their point is that women have crappy pockets. So let's start out with. So we talked about having an introduction, and if you look at the first couple of paragraphs here, they basically come out and say, you know what, this actually is a thing, and they give this basic idea about, we could carry handbags, yada, yada, yada. And then they go ahead and then they say, all right, we want to just find out how bad pockets are. And then they move into this next little chunk and they talk about measuring pockets, actually going ahead and measuring stuff. And so then they have this really cool sort of interactive thing where they show all the different pocket sizes and they have this awesome animation. Super cool to explain that, look, here's men's pockets, here's women's pockets. And then they're going to sort of take this idea about women's versus men's pockets and then sort of dive deeper into this data. And to do this, they then turn around and start asking, well, what about skinny jeans versus non-skinny jeans? What about a whole bunch of other things, front pockets versus back pockets? I think, so now they do a little bit more comparison about how those pockets look. I think we then turn around and say what can fit in these things, and so you can go and grab, at least I think you should be able to. At one point you were able to. Anyway, so you can go ahead and sort of try to put things in these pockets. They go from the different brands, so they go into a lot of different things. All right, so that's a lot of sort of detailed results. And then we have this sort of conclusion where you have basically the take-home message, which is that pockets are important, and this is their concluding statement. Now, finally, there is some of the geeky level things about, you can go and download the data so you can actually grab their data and do the same thing, which is pretty cool. And then sort of see how they measure sizes and all that sort of stuff. But the end result is that the presentation outline that we talked about, which is given here in terms of a background information, some data source and methods, then the results, and then some discussion. This actually happens quite a lot and is a fairly standard structure, even if it's not explicitly labeled as such. So this section, I've got some suggestions for making presentations in particular. So these are going to be sort of in-person oral presentations as opposed to written presentations. So here we go. So first off, let's talk about the figures. This is sort of most applicable towards what this course actually is all about, but I've got 3 highlights that I want to do. 1, make sure all your axis labels have an understandable label that doesn't require explanation. So particularly if someone's going to take this figure and use it somewhere else, you want the axis label to make sense and someone should be able to just read it. Figures need to have a title as well, and that describes the relationship that's being explored within that figure. So make sure you've got titles. And then finally, you want to be able to highlight inside that figure the features that you want the readers to see, because keep in mind at some point you might take this figure and use it somewhere else, or someone else might grab it and use it elsewhere. So make sure that inside your graphic you've highlighted very clearly what needs to be seen. Now, what that means per figure, that depends. So everything is gone case by case basis what that actually means, but make sure that it's clear that the reader sees what you want them to see. All right. When you're doing presentations in person, projectors are horrible in general. They have a lot lower resolution. They have a lot lower color contrast than your computer screen, and what looks great on your screen will not look good on a projector. So my general recommendation is to reduce your color palette to maybe 4 or 5 separate colors. So if you've got some sort of categorical variable, don't expect that color is going to separate them if you've got more than, say, 3 or 4 or maybe at max 5. Color just won't work then. Second, dark themes look great on your monitor, but they look horrible on a projector. So try to keep it to, dark themes. Just don't do dark themes. Do white background and dark text. That's going to be a much safer thing to do. Now, finally, we can talk about your slide style. And you might have noticed different presenters talking with or having different slide styles. Now, you can have sort of what I refer to as a minimalist slide style. Now, if you remember anything about Steve Jobs presentations, he always did this. It was typically one word on a slide, and he would then talk for a couple minutes, maybe a minute or two, about that particular topic, and then he would move on to the next slide. And really, the slides were then meant for the audience to understand that Steve was changing topics. And so some people really like that minimalist style. The second style is sort of more of a detailed version of things where you can present some details, but you don't want to present sort of an overwhelming level of it. And you can sort of see back in my slide presentation, I've sort of been doing that, where I've got some information here. I don't have a huge amount, but I'm not, well, this section was actually on purpose. So here we've got some information. It's bordering on a little bit too much, though. As you were going through this presentation, sometimes It's sort of the first ones you were like, okay, I can read that. It's not a problem. But when I got to this level, it was starting to get a little overwhelming. And this was particularly bad. This I threw in just for a very clear example of a wall of text is a horrible presentation slide. This particular slide is absolutely horrible, and I did that on purpose. So when you are thinking about your slide styles, I tend to think about having enough detail that it makes sense to someone who's looking at your slides afterwards. So I'll make a mistake of having maybe a little bit too much information on my slides, but then when I post my slides or someone else is going through my presentation slides afterwards, things actually make sense because this sort of minimalist style, well, when someone looks at my slides, they go, oh, look, you've got a minimalist style and a detailed style and a wall of text. And at the very least, I've mentioned that the wall of text is bad, but I haven't talked about the pros and cons of minimalist versus the detail style. All right, next, you can mix up your style types. That's okay to have a few slides that are sort of minimalist that sort of introduce an idea that you might talk about, and then a couple of slides that have a little bit more information, and that's fine. But what I will say is that you should probably aim towards just a couple of minutes per slide. And the idea is that if you have a bunch of slides that you just kind of fly through and maybe have a bunch of content on it that you don't talk about, it feels like you're being very rushed and your audience isn't developing a sense of what you're trying to talk about. And then finally, too few slides, well, that means that someone reviewing your slides afterwards won't gather anything from the presentation, and they have to have seen it actually live or recording in the presentation to actually understand what was said. Perhaps video recording of presentations is going to become more and more common, and maybe this is going to be less of a big deal because instead of presenting my slides, I will present a YouTube video of my presentation, which, hey, that's a brave new world that we're in, right? So at any rate, those are my slide suggestions, and that is the end of this, I believe. Yeah, that is the end of it. I will get something posted in terms of having homework assignments on this, but for right now, this is sort of our lecture series for Chapter 10, presentations. Thanks.